Well, I want to welcome you to Inspired. We're in the second week of this series, and the series Inspired, what we're looking at is the 5 most inspirational events in the Bible and the women and men that are behind them. And last week, I kicked it off. I looked at Esther from the Old Testament, and Esther was given a choice, a number of choices to fulfill her purpose, her destiny, and she chose. She said no to a life of safety, security, and wealth, and said yes to God's calling on her life, even when it meant putting her own life at risk. And she chose, said yes to God, and the world was changed. And this week, I'm going to look at this outcast by the name of Moses. Moses led an entire nation out of slavery and oppression. And Moses was one of the key characters of the Old Testament. He founded the nation of Israel. Moses was the one who brought the 10 Commandments down from the mountain. He established Israel's worship. He organized their government. He led the nation to freedom. 3 major world religions today, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they all cite Moses as a great prophet. And outside of Jesus Christ, I could make an argument that Moses was the single most influential human being that ever lived. The depth of his influence is staggering. On the Liberty Bell, there is a quote by Moses on the side. George Washington was called America's Moses. Harriet Tubman called herself Moses to the people. Abraham Lincoln quoted Moses at Gettysburg. Martin Luther King Jr., he compared himself to Moses the night before he was killed. And nearly every American president, including Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, likened himself to Moses. His story, the story of Moses, is definitely one of the most inspirational in all the Bible. And his story is found in the book of Exodus. Second book of the Bible, Exodus. And Exodus means a way out. God's way out. God's way out of difficulties in life. That's what we're going to look at. God's way through the problems of life. That's the story of Moses. And let me ask all of you a question. You ever faced a serious problem in life? Ever been in a difficult situation? Maybe you're in a tight spot right now. Maybe you are. Maybe it's in a relationship. Maybe a marriage. Maybe it has to do with your finances. Maybe it's your career, your job. Maybe it's your health. I don't know. But we face these things. If you're not facing one now, you will. I know everybody has faced difficulties in life. I know you have. We all have, because life is difficult. Life is difficult. You know where that phrase comes from? Life is difficult. That was the opening sentence of a book that's been a bestseller for over 2.5 decades. The book is called The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. He opens the book, and this book has sold over 25 million copies. First line in the book is, life is difficult. I remember the first time I read that many, many years ago. I got the book, I read that line. I went and got my journal. I wrote it in big black letters right in my journal. Life is difficult. Then I wrote it again. Then I wrote it again right there. And then I wrote it a 4th time. I actually never finished the book. That line was enough for me right there. That was it. Over 3,000 years ago, Moses found himself in a very difficult situation when he went to a man named Pharaoh. Pharaoh, he said, you got to set the people free, the Israelites. It's found in Exodus 14. And many of you know the story, but I'll recap it a little bit. The story, you know, Charlton Heston took the people out into the desert. There they met up with Cecil B. DeMille. They got the Red Sea behind them. They got mountain ranges on both sides. There's Pharaoh's army, the Egyptian army, which was the most powerful in the world at that time. They're coming at him. They're ready to eat their lunch. Imagine that difficult situation. What do you do in a difficult situation? How do you make it through those times? How do you make it through it? When you feel life squeezing in on you And again, it could be a personal thing, could be a relationship, money, career, health, whatever. Where do you find the strength to make it through those difficult times? Not around them, but through them. Where do you find the strength to do that? God wants to take us through the problems of life, not around them, not avoid them. God wants us to take us right through them, because that's when we grow. That's when change happens, when we don't avoid them, but we face them head on. I've got a very simple 3-point outline, very easy today. We're going to talk about what we must know, what we must face, and what we must do if we're going to make it through the difficult times of life. And we're going to grow, and we're going to change from them. And so I'd encourage you, write this down. If you're in a difficult situation now, write it down. If you're not in one right now, you also could use writing it down, because you will be one day. Then you'll go, where are those notes? Why didn't I take notes that week? So you could write it down also. I think it'll come in handy. Let's look at the first one. Going through a difficult time, here's something you must know. You must know God has a plan, no matter how tough it gets, no matter how squeezed in you feel. No, God's got a plan in this. God's at work in this. This can make all the difference. It can turn out, why is this happening to me? And you did this to me. And I'm never going to get out of this. It can turn it into it is what it is. How can I grow? How can I learn? How can I change? What can God do in this? And remember Moses, he faced at the Red Sea. He's leading the Israelites out. And the Red Sea's on one side, Egyptian army on the other, with Pharaoh. They're rushing towards him. The sea's uncrossable. And we need to understand at that time, those Israelites that he's leading to freedom, they had been enslaved for over 400 years. That's longer than the transatlantic slave trade of Britain and America. That's what's going on here. God finally, moves in and says, this has got to stop. This is not how you treat people. And God sends Moses back to Egypt to set the people free. And Moses was an old man at this time. Moses was old at this time. I mean, he should have been like, in Florida or Sun City, playing golf and talking about when he's going to eat dinner, stuff like that. But he goes back, he confronts Pharaoh. Pharaoh releases the people after a little struggle, and they take off. They're following Moses. Look what happens, Exodus 14, 2 and 3. God speaking, God says, tell the people to march towards Pi-hahiroth, between Migdal and the sea. Camp there along the shore, opposite of Baal-zephon. Then Pharaoh will think the Israelites are confused. They're trapped between the wilderness and the sea. They're in this difficult situation right here. And who got them into this situation? How did they end up in this jam right here? Look at those first 3 words. Tell the people. Who's talking right there? That's God talking right there. God told them to go there. God got them in this difficult situation they're in. God put them right there. And why is that? Because God's got a plan. God's got a plan. He put them in that place so God could show up and he could liberate those people from that slavery and that oppression. God's always got a plan, even in difficulties we find ourselves in. We don't always understand God's plan. God's always got one. God's at work. We can pretend God's not there. We can not think about God for years. We could run in the opposite direction of God. We could do so many things that screw our life up so much that we would say, God could never work in my life anymore. God could never be at work in my life after what I've done. That's not the case. God's always got a plan, and God's always at work. God will never leave you. Look at Jeremiah 29:11. It says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. The plans to give you hope and future. Circle plans to prosper you if you're taking notes. Circle hope, circle future. That is God's plan for you, no matter what you're going through right now. God's always got a plan, and it always involves those things. God's got a plan. We accept that. But you know what we have to take with God's plan? We got to take God's timing. That's what's difficult sometimes. God's plan is at work in our lives 100% of the time. God's timing is what's difficult for us to handle. You know, waiting on God for maybe a long period of time. That's what's difficult. We're not patient people, are we? Do you like to wait? No, I don't like to wait about anything. I realized it the other day. I put something in the microwave, I'm yelling, hurry. I remember the other night I got a frozen pizza out of the freezer. I'm looking at the instructions. It says microwave this pizza for 6 minutes. I thought, who's got time for that? We don't like to wait. We want things faster always. We're not patient people. We're microwaving, instant messaging, Amazon Prime overnight buying, fast food eating, instant messaging, horn honking people. That's us. In fact, Robert Levine wrote a book, Geography of Time. He says we should come up with a new measurement of time. It's called the honkosecond. It's the time between when a light changes and the person behind you honks their horn. He said it's the shortest unit measurement of time in science. It's true. We don't like to wait. I don't like to wait in traffic, online, on the phone, or on God. Moses had incredible endurance. He spent most of his life waiting on God. From the time God gave him the vision, the dream of setting these people free in Egypt, till it actually happened and they entered the promised land. Do you know how many years that was? 80 years. 80 years. You wait and not give up on something for 80 years? He spent 40 years in Midian out in the desert before God said, start. 40 years. Do you ever get tired of waiting on God? It's hard to wait on God and not get discouraged, not give up. It's very hard. One of the tests of faith is how well we wait. Really is. We gotta, in those waiting periods, we gotta keep our eyes on the vision, keep our eyes on the goal, keep our eyes on what counts, and not give up, not get discouraged. But it's hard to wait on God. It is. If you're a person that desires to get married and that hasn't happened yet, it's hard to wait. Or if you're a childless couple and you're waiting to start a family, that's hard. It's very hard. Someone who's lost their job and you're trying to get one that provides the income you need. Or if you're a depressed person and you're just waiting for a morning to come when you wake up and want to live. Or if you're a kid that's kind of awkward or clumsy and you're waiting for the day when somebody would pick you on the playground to play some game. Or if you're a person of color, speak a different language, coming from another country, and you're waiting for the day when people will judge you, not by the color of your skin or the language you speak, but by the content of your character. Every one of us will come to a juncture in our life when we've got to wait on God. Got to wait on God. And we have to remind ourselves, God's at work, even though I've been waiting a long time. God's at work. God's got a plan. His plan involves a hope and a future for me. God's plan works 100% of the time. Difficulty for us is waiting. But God's at work. Look at Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, been called according to his purpose. You're committed to God? You're committed to God. Wait on God. Wait on God and recognize, even in difficult times, God's going to use what you're going through. One day you'll look back at the difficult time. If you don't give up, you'll say, you know what? It is what it is. Even the bad was good. Eventually you'll say that. As crazy, as outrageous, outlandish as that sounds. Those of us that have walked with Christ for any period of time will go, you know what? It's happened. It has actually happened in my life. Even the good, even the bad was used for good. If we're going to get through tough times, it's the first thing. We got to remind ourselves. We got to know God's got a plan. God's at work in this. God's never going to leave me. Here's the second thing. Second thing, must face your greatest fear. Going through a tough time. You're going to have to, I guarantee it, face your greatest fear possibly. And anybody here afraid of anything? Anybody got any phobias? Any phobias? Who's afraid of mice? Who's afraid of mice? Anybody? What about spiders? Come on, admit it. Spiders? No? Okay. What about heights? Afraid of heights? Yes, yep. I'm afraid of heights. I don't like being this tall. Yeah. Anybody afraid of water? Anybody afraid of closed-in places? What about anybody afraid of raising your hand in a public place? Yeah. Anybody afraid of snakes? Oh, maybe you've heard this. This is a U.S. government manual for Peace Corps workers in the Amazon jungle. If they get attacked by an anaconda snake, biggest snake in the world, grows up to 35 feet long, can swallow a 400-pound animal. This is what they say. If you're attacked by an anaconda, number one, don't run. The snake is faster than you are. Number two, lie flat on the ground. Put your arms tight against your sides and your legs tight against one another. Number three, tuck in your chin. Number four, the snake will come and begin to nudge and climb over your body. Number five, do not panic. Right. Number six, after the snake has examined you, it'll begin to swallow you from the feet end. They always start at the feet end. Permit the snake to swallow your feet and ankles. Do not panic. Number seven, the snake will now begin to suck your legs into its body. You must lie perfectly still. This will take a long time. Number eight, when the snake has reached your knees, slowly and with as little movement as possible, reach down, take your knife, and gently slide it into the side of the snake's mouth, between the edge of its mouth and your leg. Suddenly then rip upwards, severing its head. Number nine, be sure to have your knife. Oh, where's my knife? Oh no, then you panic. Facing our fears is not what most of us want to do in tough times. We don't want to face our fears. I want the easiest route through this difficult situation I'm in. That's what I want. I want to go, God, give me a map that's going to show me the easiest way through this thing. So God says, okay, I'll give you a map. You know what the map is? Map's the Bible. And you know what the Bible does? It always takes us to the place we don't want to go. Always. We say, God, I want a better relationship, with someone. I want a better marriage, whatever. I want a better relationship. God gives us a map. We open the map. We unfold it. You know where it goes to? It goes to admit where you're wrong. Oh, wait, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. I mean, we're having difficulty with anybody in our life. Marriage, boss, parent, kid, anyone. We always think we're right. Bible says, admit where you're wrong. Maybe we're dealing with a hurt, a habit, some destructive pattern, draining life out of us. We want to deal with it. We do. How can I break this habit, this pattern, this addiction, whatever? We get out the map. You know where it goes to? Tell somebody what you're facing. We go, I'm not going to do that. I want to keep it to myself. I don't want to tell anybody. Someone said, we're only as sick as our secrets. We're only as sick as our secrets. The hurts and habits that we hide and don't tell anyone, they make us sicker. That's why God says, you want to know how to deal with it? You got to open up. You got to tell someone about it. God's plan took Moses to the one place he didn't want to go. Because the one thing that we're not willing to face, that's most likely why we're stuck. We're not facing this one thing we need to face. That's why we're stuck in life. And Moses, he had a fear. He was afraid of a guy named Pharaoh. He was afraid of going back to Egypt. See, 40 years before, he killed an Egyptian, and he ran to escape. He was afraid. He goes back to Egypt. They're going to arrest him. Pharaoh's going to have him killed. So he ran as far as he could out into the desert. 40 years staying out there. Imagine not facing a fear for 40 years, something you fear. I think some of us can actually. Then God comes to Moses in a burning bush. Exodus 3:10. Moses says, he says, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt. I want to use you to set the people free. Moses does it. Imagine the courage. He goes back. Who's the first person he faces when he goes back? Faces Pharaoh. Faces Pharaoh. Plagues come. Pharaoh lets the people go. The Israelites are taken off. All of a sudden, Pharaoh has second thoughts. Takes off after him with the Egyptian army. They get to the Red Sea. Who's Moses going to face again? Pharaoh. Imagine how Moses felt. I'm sure he said, God, I told you this was going to happen. I told you this was never going to work. I knew it. Look what happened to Moses. Exodus 14:9. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, everything Pharaoh could throw at him, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea. Moses went back to Egypt. He faced Pharaoh. Now Moses at the Red Sea, facing his fear again. Pharaoh. You imagine the courage it took for Moses to leave the comfort he was in, out in the desert, be used by God for all of this? I mean, he had to face the one thing he didn't want to face, and he did it. You mark it down. You and I have a situation that's caused fear in our life. It's created great fear. We face it. We face it head on. We'll have a rush of satisfaction if we face it, knowing we displayed courage. When you take the initiative, you have a difficult conversation with someone, boss, partner, friend, kid, spouse, parent, you have it instead of shrinking back. When you're wrestling with a pattern of addictive behavior, you take the courage, bring it out into the light, tell somebody about it, come to Celebrate Recovery on a Friday night when it'd be a lot easier. That's right, a lot easier to just stay home. Don't let anybody know. Hide the whole thing. We do that over and over, not face what we need to face. You know what will happen? When we don't face what we need to face, if that becomes a pattern, we'll eventually think of ourselves. Somebody, I can't handle the challenges of life. I can't handle the difficulties of life. And then, you know what? You become a victim. That's what happens. Moses had the courage. He had the courage to face the one thing he didn't want to face, Pharaoh. Where did he find the courage? Look at Hebrews 11:27. It tells us. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one thing, on the one who is invisible. Where do you find the courage to face that one thing you don't want to face? You know where you find the courage? You find it in someone greater than that great fear you have. There's only one person greater, and it's God. God. That's where Moses found the courage to face Pharaoh, right there. He redirected his focus, took his focus off Pharaoh and the Egyptian army. He put it on God. God is greater. Took his eyes off Pharaoh. Took his eyes off what Pharaoh would do to him. Put his focus on what God would do through him. Took his eyes off the greatness of Egypt. Put his focus on the greatness of God. You're in a tough spot. Get your eyes off the problem, which is great. I recognize some of the problems you're facing are very great. Take your eyes off of that. Put your eyes on one who is greater. Redirect your focus to God's love for you, God's grace for you, God's mercy, God's strength, God's presence in your life, God's peace for you. Redirect your focus. Focus on those things. The love that God has for you, God's presence in your life, is much greater than any problem. Then once you remind yourself, God's got a plan. God's got a plan in this. And then you find the courage through God to face your greatest fear. Then, here's the third thing. Here's something you must do. You must take the next step with faith. That's number 3. Got to take the next step with faith. And as I read the Bible, I'm always struck by how often a step of faith has got to be taken before God's power is released. And they're at the Red Sea, and there's this interesting exchange there. The army is on one side, Red Sea is on the other. The Israelites, the people say something, then Moses says something, then God says something. Take a look at this. The people see Pharaoh's army coming at them. The Red Sea's there, it's uncrossable. They're afraid. They get up. They start complaining to Moses. Look at this, Exodus 14, verse 11. Then they turned against Moses and complained, "Why'd you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? Why'd you make us leave? Didn't we tell you? No, leave us alone while we were still in Egypt. Our Egyptian slavery was far better than dying out here in the wilderness." They want to go back. They're afraid. They start playing the blame game. They're blaming Moses now. That's what we do when we're in a tight spot. We go, "You got me into this." We start blaming people. Rather than saying, "What's God going to do in and through this?" They blame Moses. Moses, he stands up in the middle of the crowd. Look what he says. Verse 13, Moses told the people, "Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm." And as spiritual as that sounds, God says, wait a minute, God's got something to say. Verse 15, then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Don't tell them to stand there and be calm. Tell them to get moving towards the Red Sea." Sounds so spiritual. We say, "Well, I'm just going to stand here. I'm just going to wait on God right here." God says, what? You got to get moving. Take a step of faith. Bible says Moses walked right to the water before God parted the sea. Real faith is not sitting, waiting for God to act. And real faith is not acting in our own strength. Real faith is taking the step that God would want us to take in the difficult situation we're in. They took the step. They start moving towards the Red Sea. Look at Exodus 14:21. Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side. If there's one thing I want you to remember from all of this today, it's this. The Red Sea didn't split until they began moving towards the Red Sea. Then it split. You look at your life. You go, "I want this to get better. This is a situation I'm in. I want this relationship to get better. I want fill in the blank. I need it to get better." What do? Do you sit back and wait for God to somehow make it better? Or do you just try to solve it in your own energy? How do you make it better? You take the next step towards what you know God would want you to do, as difficult as that may be. Not what you want to do, what God would want you to do. That's when God works. The Red Sea did not split until they started moving in that direction. We want a money in the bank guarantee. We want a money in the bank guarantee. We want the waters to divide while we're sitting in an easy chair, doing nothing. James 2:17 says, in the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. So there's a guy named Jack. I'm making the name up. He hasn't talked to his son in years. Hasn't talked to him in years. And there's something stirring inside of him, and he just thinks, I got to connect with my son. This is not right. I got to talk to my son. What would you tell him to do? Would you tell him, hey, if you haven't talked to him in years, you better pray about this thing quite a while. In fact, I think my church is coming. I think they're going to do a 5-week series on reconciling relationships. Why don't you come to that before you do anything? If you haven't talked to him in years, I think you ought to write down everything. Take a month, really every day, write something down about what you would say when you connect with him. Is that what you would say? Or would you say, get moving, call your son up? Call them up. Now, set up a time. Set up a time to get together. That doesn't mean you don't pray. Doesn't mean you don't pray. You pray absolutely while you're taking that next step with faith. There is no doubt Moses was praying big time as they're walking towards the Red Sea. But God would say, get moving. Get moving. So what's the next step for you in the difficult situation you're in right now? What's the next step? Whatever. Relationship, maybe it's a job, money, school. Your next step is probably coming to your mind right now as I speak. That's the step. And I'm going to pray that you would have the courage to take that step. Let's bow our heads together. Let's pray together. And God, you know what's on our hearts, and you know what is on the mind of every person here right now. And you know what we're thinking. And as we think about this next step that we would take with faith to reconcile a relationship or get our finances to a place where we're not under pressure every day, or the next step with our job, career, next step in our personal life, next step that has to do with a hurt or a habit, our own faith maybe. God, we bring what you brought to our mind to you right now. And I ask that you would help all of us to understand that, God, you got a plan in this. And help us all to remember that even as we face our greatest fear, you're greater. You'll never leave us. And God, give us the strength and the courage to take that one step. Not 10 steps, not 12 steps. Take the one step. And you might want to pray, God, I need an exodus. I need a way out, a way through. And I want your way, God, not my way. I've tried my way. And for some of you, maybe you haven't talked to God in a long, long time. And maybe you need to say to him that your first step is to put your faith in Jesus Christ. To say right now, God, I need the strength, the grace, the forgiveness that you promise through your Son. I need that in my life. And I want to start there. And I realize I need direction, I need guidance, and I'm looking to you for it. Help me to see where you want me to go. And give me the courage and the strength takes a step in the direction of what only you can do in this situation. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.